Okay, gotta say, this is wild. You sent over some pretty interesting stuff. Looking at these statistical models trying to, like, predict these Premier League matches,
Mm.
right? On April 1st, 2025.
Right. Yeah,
Football, I mean, everyone knows it's so unpredictable, it's always fun to see how data science tries to make sense of it all.
it really is.
Yeah.
Applying all these serious analytical methods to something most people think is all chance and emotion.
Exactly. So today, like, we're diving deep right into these predictions. For Wolverhampton Wanderers
Right?
versus West Ham,
Mm.
and Nottingham Forest taking on Manchester United. I'm curious, how do these models even work? Like, what does the data suggest is going to happen?
Yeah, let's dig in.
So this report, dig.pdf, uses a ton of different models, really.
It does.
We're talking Poisson model, which looks at, like, historical scoring. Then there's Random Forest and GBM, gradient boosting machine,
That's it, yeah.
which learn from, like, tons of match data. And then it gets really complex, stacked models with, XGBoost, neural networks, MLPs,
Yeah.
Bayesian, bagging, profit, even ELO ratings, and Monte Carlo simulations.
So that's right.
That's a lot of analysis.
Absolutely. Each model tackles a prediction in a different way. It looks for probabilities and patterns and all that past data. But the fact that we're using so many methods shows you how hard it is to predict, a dynamic game like football.
Absolutely. So our mission is to break down the key predictions for these two matches, see where they agree and where they, totally disagree. And in the end, we want to understand, what does all this data you gave me actually say about the most likely results? And maybe even touch on, some betting angles.
Sure.
But remember, we're just going off this report. We're not, like, giving out guarantees or anything, just seeing what the numbers say.
Exactly, yeah. We're just looking at the probabilities.
Okay.
And keeping in mind that any prediction comes with some uncertainty.
Right. All right, let's kick things off with Wolverhampton Wanderers versus West Ham United. Now, the report seems to give us, like, two sets of predictions to start.
Yep.
First, prediction from memory, which uses Poisson, Random Forest, and GBM. And these initially favor West Ham slightly, with the most likely outcomes being a 1-1 draw or a 1-2 West Ham win. Anything jump out at you from these initial predictions?
Well, it's interesting to see that these different models, they all arrive at a similar conclusion, that it'll be a close match, but West Ham has a slight edge. The Poisson model usually looks at, like, expected goals based on past attacking and defensive records, while Random Forest and GBM, they're more advanced machine learning. They can find those more complicated relationships in the data. So them agreeing suggests there might be underlying factors that give West Ham that slight advantage.
Okay, interesting. But then we get the second prediction. This one uses a stacked model, which
Yes.
has, like, XGBoost and neural networks,
Right.
and a Monte Carlo simulation. And it tells a completely different story, actually strongly favoring a Wolves win.
Yeah, it's a big difference. That probably comes from the different types of data these complex models are using and what specific features they focus on. Stacked models, they combine predictions from multiple base models. Potentially, they're picking up on more subtle patterns in the data. And the fact that the Monte Carlo simulation, which, runs a huge number of possible scenarios, also favors a Wolves win, well, that just adds another layer to the whole thing. It really shows you how much these predictions can change depending on the model you choose and what data you feed it.
Yeah, no, that's true. Okay, so we have these two opposing views. The report then, like, looks at model accuracy and assigns weights based on, how accurate those groups of models have been in the past.
Yeah.
The Poisson, Random Forest, and GBM group is about 60 to 65% accurate, and it gets a weight of 0.65. Meanwhile, the stacked model group has an accuracy of, like, 54 to 56% and gets a weight of 0.55. How should we understand these weights?
Well, the idea behind those weights is to give more weight to the models that have, been more accurate in the past.
Yeah.
Higher accuracy means a model has been right more often, historically, so it might be more reliable for future predictions. The weights are a way to include past performance in a combined prediction, or what we call an ensemble prediction.
That makes sense. So they use weighted averaging to get to a final prediction. They estimated that the memory-based prediction gave Wolves about a 25% chance of winning, 30% for a draw, and 45% chance of a West Ham win. These are then combined with the probabilities from the stacked model. So after, crunching the numbers and applying the weights, we get weighted averages of roughly 47.73% for a Wolves win, 33.21% for a draw, 39.6% for a West Ham win.
That's right. They multiply those probabilities from each model group by their weights, and then they add those up for each outcome. Wolves win, draw, West Ham win. That gets them those weighted averages. This ensemble approach, it's pretty common. It's a way to try to, combine the strengths of different analytical techniques.
Okay. Now, the report says these weighted probabilities, they add up to a little more than 100%, probably because of rounding.
Probably.
So they normalize those figures to get the final probabilities, and this gives us a final ensemble prediction of roughly 39.78% for a Wolves win, 27.68% for a draw, and 32.55% for a West Ham win. So based on all of this, Wolves end up being the slight favorites. That's quite a change from that initial memory-based prediction.
Yeah, it is a big shift. It shows how the stacked models' stronger preference for a Wolves win really affected things, even with that slightly lower historical accuracy. The ensemble method is basically trying to find a balance, right? It considers all these different predictions.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay, so what do these probabilities tell us about, betting? The report has betting odds of 2.40 for Wolves, 3.25 for the draw, and 3.00 for West Ham. And then it calculates the implied probability from those odds.
Right.
For Wolves, that's about 41.67%. For the draw, it's around 30.77%. And for West Ham, roughly 33.33%.
Yeah, that implied probability, it basically shows how likely the bookmakers think each outcome is. It's based on the odds they're offering. You calculate it by dividing 1 by the decimal odds.
Right. And when you compare those implied probabilities to the ensemble probabilities from the models, the report says there's basically no value in betting on any of these outcomes.
Wow.
It's a slightly negative expected value for everything. It even mentions the Kelly Criterion, which is a fancier betting strategy, and says it also recommends no bet here. Could you explain why that is?
Basically, if the model says an event is less likely to happen than the implied probability from the bookmaker's odds, betting on that event will lose you money in the long run. In this case, for all three outcomes, the ensemble probabilities are either very close to or a bit lower than the implied probabilities, meaning the odds the bookmakers are offering, they don't really give the bettor an advantage, at least according to this analysis.
Hmm.
And the Kelly Criterion, which looks at the potential advantage and the size of your, betting bankroll, agrees that there's no bet here. That suggests the betting market is already pretty good at pricing in the probabilities that our models are finding, which means it's tough to find an edge, even with all this fancy analysis.
So even though the ensemble says Wolves are a little more likely to win, the odds for them aren't good enough to make it a worthwhile bet.
Yeah, that's right. It seems like the betting market, based on those odds, already accounts for the likelihood of a Wolves win.
Okay, let's step back and look at the big takeaways from this Wolverhampton Wanderers versus West Ham United deep dive. The ensemble model shows it's going to be really close.
Yeah.
Wolves have a slight edge, but West Ham definitely still a threat. The most likely outcomes are a 1-1 draw, a 2-1 Wolves win, or a 1-2 West Ham win. And the report says it's very likely both teams will score and leans towards over 2.5 goals total.
Right. Even in that initial memory-based prediction, the Poisson model suggested that both teams were likely to score. And then, when you add in the fact that the win probabilities are so close, well, it makes sense that a high-scoring draw or a close win for either side are the most likely scenarios.
All right, so let's switch gears now to that other match we're looking at, Nottingham Forest versus Manchester United, also happening on April 1st, 2025. And here we've got predictions from a bunch of different models. The Poisson model expects Forest to score around 1.7 goals, and United around 0.60 goals, suggesting a pretty close match, with Forest having a slight advantage in terms of expected goals. What do you think of that?
Well, it's interesting. The Poisson model, it really depends on the average number of goals each team has scored historically. So this slight favor towards Forest in expected goals probably means they're seen as having a slightly stronger attack, or maybe United has a slightly weaker defense based on their past performances.
Okay. Then there's the MLP, the multi-layer perceptron.
The neural network.
Right, the neural network. And it tells a totally different story. It gives a 68.6% probability to a Manchester United win and a tiny 0.08% chance of a draw. The report says this is likely because of injury adjustments. That's huge. compared to the Poisson prediction.
Oh, yeah, it's a massive difference. Neural networks, they're really good at finding complex patterns in data.
Yeah.
And if the model knows about key injuries that are affecting, say, Nottingham Forest, that could shift the prediction way towards Manchester United, especially if they're potentially stronger, even if United also has some injuries. You know, the almost 0% chance of a draw is pretty striking too.
Wow, yeah. Okay. So moving past the more statistically based Poisson model, let's see what some of the machine learning approaches predicted. First up, the GBM, or gradient boosting machine.
Okay.
And it goes almost completely the opposite way, giving Forrest a strong 61.4% probability of winning.
It's another big contrast. It shows you how different models focus on different parts of the data. The GBM might be putting more emphasis on recent form or like overall squad strength,
Mm-hmm.
which might still favor Forest, even with the potential injuries for Manchester United. It seems like it's not as affected by individual players being out compared to the neural network, at least in this case.
All right, so next we've got the random Forest model, and this one's a bit more balanced, favoring a Forest win slightly at 43%, with a 29% chance of a draw and 28% for United to win.
Right. The random forest is an ensemble of like many decision trees, so it often gives a more moderate prediction by averaging the predictions of all its parts. This result suggests the match is pretty even, but with a slight edge to Forest.
Gotcha. And lastly, the ELO rating, which this one also factors in injury impact, and it strongly favors Manchester United at 32.1%. But it gives a surprisingly high 43.3% chance of a draw.
Yeah, the ELO system is mostly based on head-to-head results and the relative strength of the teams from those results. The fact that it includes injury information here probably explains why it favors United. But that high probability of a draw suggests that even with injuries, Forest might be tough to beat outright, at home. Or maybe it thinks United's potentially weakened state makes a draw more likely.
Okay, so we got all these different predictions. What does the final ensemble result say? Combining all these individual models,
Let's see.
it leans slightly towards a draw at 43.3%, with a 32.1% probability of a Manchester United win and a 24.6% chance of a Forest win. So after all that, the most likely outcome is a draw.
Wow, so even though some models lean towards United at first because of injuries, the bigger picture points to a draw. Yeah, that's a key takeaway for sure. The ensemble method tries to bring together all the different signals from each model. And here, those high draw probabilities from the ELO model, plus the balancing effect of the other models, led to a draw being the most likely outcome.
And then the Monte Carlo simulation, which runs tons and tons of simulations based on those probabilities, backs up that ensemble result, giving it a 43.3% chance of a draw, 30.7 for a United win, and 26.4 for a Forest win. That consistency between the ensemble and the Monte Carlo simulation is pretty convincing.
Definitely. It makes us more confident that a draw really is the most likely result. The Monte Carlo simulation basically explores all the possible outcomes based on those probabilities from the models. And since it agrees with the ensemble, that suggests this is a pretty solid finding.
Okay, so based on all this analysis, the betting recommendations are a draw is most probable, then a Manchester United win, and a Forest win, least probable. What about the number of goals? The report says over 2.5 goals is likely at 65% because the teams are playing offensively, while under 2.5 goals is less likely but still possible at 35%.
So even though the prediction leans towards a draw, it looks like it'll be a pretty open and attacking game with both teams scoring. That's because of how the models see their current attacking abilities.
Okay, so to sum up the key findings for this Nottingham Forest versus Manchester United match, the ensemble model suggests a close match, with a draw being the most likely outcome.
Yeah,
We saw some big differences in what the individual models predicted.
we did.
Poisson and GBM favored Forest, while MLP and ELO favored United, probably because of those injuries. But the consistent probability of a draw from both the ensemble analysis and the Monte Carlo simulations, well, that's the main thing to remember here.
Absolutely. It really shows you how uncertain things are when different factors, like team form and injuries, are pulling the predictions in different directions. The ensemble approach tries to give more balanced perspective, and it says that a draw is the most likely result given all those factors.
So you wanted to understand how these models try to predict football outcomes. And as we've seen, even using lots of different approaches, it's clear that football is just unpredictable. The fact that different models weight factors differently and can come up with such different conclusions is a big part of this whole analytical process.
Exactly. It reminds us that these models are helpful tools for understanding probabilities, but they're not perfect. Football is complex, and it's often hard to predict.
So this deep dive brings up some really interesting questions. How much weight should we or these models even give to different types of models? How do you measure those intangible factors that the models don't explicitly include, like team morale or, a player suddenly having an amazing game? And as these models get better and better, will they ever be able to consistently beat the odds? Or will football, always be beautifully unpredictable? It's a fascinating area, and it feels like we're only just starting to understand these complex dynamics.
Yeah, those are the key questions. The progress in these modeling techniques and the
Mhm.
constant new data will definitely help us get better at analyzing and understanding football. But the human element and the unpredictable nature of sports, they're probably always going to be a big and exciting part of it.
Well, that wraps up this deep dive. Thanks so much for bringing this interesting stuff to us. It's given us a lot to think about.
My pleasure. It's always fun to explore these topics.
Absolutely. Until next time.
Take care.